I finish up the meth sale with Tuco, but just as we're about to part ways, Tuco explodes into a violent argument with his underling, No Doze. It's a gruesome scene, and Tuco leaves No Doze battered and unconscious. He grabs No Doze's lifeless body and takes off with Gonzo. But their journey is cut short when No Doze's breathing stops. Tuco orders Jesse and me to perform CPR, but I know it's too late. No Doze is gone, and my attempts to explain that CPR won't work fall on deaf ears. Tuco's anger boils over, and he vents his frustrations on No Doze's lifeless corpse before instructing Gonzo to dispose of the body. Returning home, I'm caught the following morning by Skylar, mindlessly flipping through channels in a state of stress. My efforts to initiate intimacy with her are met with resistance, as she demands that I control myself during times of distress. That night, Jesse and I convene to discuss the dangerous predicament with Tuco. We're convinced that he wants us dead, since we were witnesses to No Doze's murder. Jesse, consumed by paranoia, has procured a gun with the intent of eliminating Tuco before he can eliminate us. Meanwhile, Skylar and Marie's relationship is crumbling due to Marie's shoplifting and her refusal to address the issue. As tension builds on that front, Hank and Gomez are busy watching grainy surveillance footage of two thieves breaking into a chemical plant to steal methylamine, supposedly for the production of old-fashioned biker crank. Unbeknownst to Hank, one of those masked thieves in the grainy video is none other than his own brother-in-law. On my drive home at night, I spot a suspicious van parked near my house. Meeting with Jesse, I inquire about whether Tuco has learned anything about my identity. Jesse vehemently denies sharing any information with Tuco. I begin to formulate an alternative plan to simply shooting Tuco, a plan involving processing castor beans into the deadly poison known as ricin. We intend to cook a batch of meth laced with ricin to give to Tuco. Ricin poisoning mimics flu-like symptoms, and the toxin is virtually untraceable by conventional means, allowing us to eliminate Tuco without raising suspicion. While I'm occupied with the ricin preparation, Hank reaches out, calling me from a crime scene. He's discovered Gonzo's lifeless body. Gonzo, who had returned to properly dispose of No Doze's body, but met a tragic end under a pile of cars, his arm crushed by a piece of debris from the junkyard, causing him to bleed out. Initially, Hank suspects that Tuco was responsible for Gonzo's demise. This further reinforces Jesse and my belief that Tuco is determined to eliminate anyone with knowledge of No Doze's murder. I instruct Jesse to flee while I stay behind to protect my family. That evening I returned home, and Skylar, ever inquisitive, questioned me about my late-night whereabouts. My responses remained as guarded as ever, but before I could offer any explanation, a phone call interrupted our conversation. Stepping outside, I found Jesse parked in front of my house. To my absolute horror, Tuco is hiding in the back seat. He orders me at gunpoint to get in and forces Jesse to drive us away. Tuco, that maniac, had us at gunpoint, forcing Jesse and me to accompany him to his uncle Hector Salamanca's place, right near the Mexican border. He laid out his crazy plan, and I wasn't thrilled about it one bit. Tuco wanted to drag me south of the border to cook meth for him, like some kind of indentured chemist. Jesse, poor Jesse, was just a pawn in this nightmare. Over at the DEA's office, my brother-in-law, Hank, was briefing his colleagues about Tuco's crumbling empire. We dismantled the whole operation, and all that was left was to arrest Tuco. Hank put on a brave face for the team, but he confided in Gomez that he thought Tuco had already vanished across the border. Hank then went to meet my family, who were looking for me after my sudden disappearance. Skylar was worried about my strange behavior and the mysterious phone call I got the night before. After some prodding from Marie, Hank reluctantly admitted that he looked into that call and found no record of it, implying I had a secret. Skylar thought this secret might relate to my disappearance, and Marie wondered if it had something to do with my recent pot dealings with Jesse. Hank promised to check on Jesse and see if he knew anything about my whereabouts. Meanwhile, Jesse and I were scamming, trying to figure out how to get rid of Tuco and escape his clutches. It was getting worse, as Tuco suspected Gonzo of betraying him, and he'd eventually realize Gonzo was dead, putting the heat on us. Plus, Tuco's cousins were en route, so we had to act fast. I had a bag of meth poisoned with ricin in my pocket, and I tried to slip it into Tuco's food. But Hector, the old guy in a wheelchair, intervened, ruining the plan. Hector managed to convey to Tuco that Jesse and I were up to something, and Tuco grabbed Jesse, demanding answers. I had to distract Tuco, calling him every name in the book, and it worked. Jesse got a chance to hit Tuco with a rock. During the struggle, I grabbed Tuco's rifle, and Jesse got his hands on a pistol, shooting Tuco in the side. We kicked him into a hole, debating whether to finish him off, but I decided to leave him there to bleed out as we made our escape. But things went south fast. We realized we didn't have the car keys and saw a vehicle approaching, thinking it was Tuco's cousins. I dropped the rifle as Jesse and I took off on foot. From our vantage point, we couldn't see it was Hank who'd followed Jesse's car. Meanwhile, Tuco, wounded but alive, reached Jesse's car and leaned against it. Hank approached, mistaking Tuco for Jesse, but quickly realized his mistake. Tuco grabbed the dropped rifle and opened fire on Hank. They exchanged shots, but Tuco's injuries made him miss, and Hank got the upper hand, killing him. I watched from a distance as Hank emerged victorious, and we took off into the desert. But as Hank approached Tuco's body, a bell rang, and things got even more complicated. With Tuco gone, Jesse and I decided to bury his guns and come up with a plan to cover our tracks. I hitched a ride on a pickup truck back to Albuquerque, and once I was there, I walked into a grocery store. In a bizarre move, I started stripping off my clothes until I stood there, naked and vacant-eyed. They rushed me to the hospital, and that's where I was reunited with Skylar and Junior. I claimed to have no memory of the past few days, saying I suffered from a fugue state. Meanwhile, Jesse and Badger were sitting in a car near Jesse's house, which was under police surveillance. Once the cops left, they sneaked in to grab Jesse's cooking supplies and RV. Badger's cousin Clovis offered to keep the RV in storage for a fee of $1,000. Jesse didn't have enough money, but he promised to pay him back. With Badger's encouragement, Clovis agreed to keep the RV safe and sound. Afterward, he asked Badger to call the police from a payphone. While I was stuck in the hospital, Jesse rented a room with Wendy at a motel. The police barged in and arrested Jesse. Hank interrogated him, convinced of his connection to Tuco. Jesse claimed he'd been at the motel with Wendy the whole weekend, and surprisingly, Wendy backed up his story, probably despite Hank. Back at the hospital, I was annoyed when the doctor told me I couldn't leave until they were sure I wouldn't have another episode. Frustrated, I asked how long that might take. The doctor said it could be weeks or even months. So, taking advantage of doctor-patient confidentiality, I admitted I faked the fugue state, just wanting some time away from my family. At the police station, Hank and Gomez tried to get an eyewitness, Hector Salamanca, to implicate Jesse, but Hector, an old-school cartel big shot, refused to cooperate, even going so far as to soil himself to spite Hank. With no concrete evidence tying Jesse to Tuco, The DEA had no choice but to release him. Jesse called me in my hospital room to say the DEA bought his story, but Hank had taken his money and car, leaving him broke. I asked him to retrieve the RV so we could get back to business, but Jesse hesitated. I thought about my finances and remembered I had some cash stashed away. I sneaked back home to check if it was still there before catching a bus back to the hospital. Back at the DEA, after examining footage of a methylamine heist, unaware that I was involved, and speculating that the thieves cooked the blue meth for Tuco, Hank attended a party celebrating his triumph over Tuco Salamanca. His colleagues gave him Tuco's grill, preserved in Lucite, as a gift. Finally, I was released from the hospital and allowed to return home. Tensions grew between Skylar and me when she asked if I had a second phone. Still pretending to be confused about the weekend's events, I denied it and leaned in for a kiss, but she turned away. Our problems were far from over.